Hi there, it's Pooky, and I'd like to respond to statements in one of Sargon of Akkad's recent videos involving the Dallas sniper attack regarding statements on how the sniper was killed. I'd like to explain why I think his position is not reasonable and deposit an alternative. For those unaware, a bomb disposal bot had C4 stuck to it and was driven to the shooter's location and detonated to eliminate the sniper. The police chief stated he made this decision due to other options requiring severe endangerment to officers. Sargon responded to this point rather negatively, and I'm going to play the part of his video so you hear it directly, not just from me.
They killed him with a drone. He was killed with what's described as a bomb robot. So the robot was used after an hours-long standoff to kill Micah Johnson, who police believe did some of the shooting. This is an unprecedented act in the history of American policing and raises concerns about due process and the use of remotely triggered lethal force by law enforcement. And I agree, and I genuinely worry about the steps the United States is taking in this direction. The police had exchanged gunfire with Johnson on the second floor of a parking garage. We saw no other option than to use our bomb robot and place a device on its extension to detonate where the suspect was, Brown said. Other options would have exposed our officers to grave danger. Brown raises an obvious question that the US military has grappled with. If a shooter is holed up in a building, who do you send, a person or a bot? Well, this is really kind of my problem. You're not in a military situation. You're in a domestic police situation, even with an active shooter. Other options might be something like waiting them out, or talking to them and trying to get them to surrender so no one else gets shot. And don't get me wrong, I understand that the officers are going to make the argument that, well, we've got the right to protect our lives at all costs and minimise the risks as much as we see fit. Well, no, you don't, actually. Because if that's the case, you may as well lock everyone up in a giant prison compound and prevent them from having any freedom whatsoever. If that's the line of thought you want to go down, you can justify the most totalitarian police state imaginable by saying, well, we've got to protect the officers first. We don't have to protect the officers first. I'm sorry. I don't want the officers' safety to be ignored, but it's not the most important thing in this situation. And I genuinely think that setting the precedent that killing citizens without due process using a drone or something approximating as much is a dangerous precedent that you really want to make sure doesn't happen again. This should be where you say no. Police officers will not murder the public with drones, even no matter how much they think it's justified. No matter how justified it looks, that is not an option. Because leaving that as an option opens the door to a world of possibilities, none of which are good. Again, I don't blame the officers, and I don't think they should be retroactively punished, but I really think that this is opening the door to something quite dystopian. And so I really think that it's just worth not going this way, just turning back, going back a couple of paces, and then going in a different direction.
He seems to be presenting 3 points. The negotiation period, including the suspect claiming to have planted numerous bombs and claimed he intended to kill more officers, was insufficient negotiation and not grounds for placing officer safety above attempts at capture despite surrender request. That due process rights in circumstances like these supersede officer safety, and in scenarios like these, the safety of the officer is a secondary concern to attempting to capture the subject alive without severe injury. And based on the article linked as a source for concern of bomb drones, quote-unquote, and the phrasing used to reference it, that having lower risk opportunity to neutralize the suspect, such as a drone, will incentivize officers to make conservative estimates and kill suspects possibly when not necessary, thus justifying the stance of increased officer endangerment to avoid this convenience option, removing someone's due process rights, which is justified if points 1 and 2 are accepted. Sargon, I think your objective is to enhance due process rights as much as possible. What I would argue your points do more harm to due process rights than good, and push further towards a police state than other options you'd have available. For a similar amount of political capital, you'd need to implement and maintain policies for these 3 points in the first place. Wanting to capture suspects alive, if at all possible, is a stance I agree with. My reasoning is we can interrogate captives to catch conspirators, extract labor from a guilty verdict, and because I have history in bioweapons, including mind control research, and it may become a more pressing concern in the coming decades, establishing a system around capturing people alive for interrogation and drug testing may be the best chance someone that's been given substances without their consent has at rescue and catching the actual culprit. But these 3 points make it harder instead of easier. If you want to capture people alive, placing officers in a more risky situation and taking out expenses in organic assets is not a good idea. Telling an officer, we don't want you to have a convenience kill option because you may use it if it's unnecessary, therefore you need to be in more danger to attempt to capture them, even though they've declined the option to surrender to protect their rights and have stated they want to kill you and there may be bombs in the building. That kind of situation and aggravated risk is going to have negative psychological effects on the officer to such an extent it's going to incentivize them to make conservative estimates in the interest of self-preservation. Consequently, they may escalate to lethal force even if it isn't necessary due to psychological duress and safety hazard. Example, the Dallas sniper claimed to have set explosives. An officer sent in for him could have tripped a wire when approaching the suspect, or the suspect could have had an explosive on his person with the intent of suicide bombing. The officers do not know whether or not this threat is credible during the time frame they have to make decisions. The most common error I see when people argue over police policy is the use of information obtained after the event transpires on how the case should have been handled. It is biologically impossible for the officer to time travel and utilize the exact details obtained after the event for use before the event occurs, yet hindsight arguments are among the most common I see. When in the situation of a lack of details, the officer needs to hypothesize over the information they do have and make judgments sometimes very rapidly, which will include psychological duress about their own safety. If an officer is sent in thinking there will be tripwires waiting to kill him or a suicide bomb on the suspect, because of the exacerbated duress he is now under, he may cut corners and shoot to kill the target even if that force was not necessary. Placing the officers under more duress and in more danger will make the situation worse, and trying to increase due process rights at the cost of police organic asset expenses will aggravate that effect. If you want to enhance due process rights and have more captures, I'd advise a different approach. Specifically, I'd say the goal should be making conservative estimates and heightened levels of concern coincide with the decision to capture the subject alive. This can be done by increasing non-lethal capture options and increasing the safety of officers performing them, not decreasing the safety. Increasing non-lethal capture options and making them safer to use and available to more officers with associated training, aiming to make capture the safest option and thus defaulted to in situations of duress, is a more reasonable reform policy. Example, the drones and robots can be outfitted for other purposes than just killing the subject. Though this requires time and resources to do, it is possible if you're willing to produce and issue more less lethal equipment with associated training for its use. Remember, not every department in the United States just gets giant warehouses full of flash grenades dropped on them. I would push the expansion of outfitting drones with less lethal capture options and putting money into R&D to improve their effectiveness, as well as trying to make the less lethal capture equipment available to more departments. We have the robots, we have the less lethal weapons. We need to put in the budget to combine them and produce enough less lethal drone models to make them available to more departments. So instead of having to pay all the organic asset attrition costs, let's instead invest that money in providing due process enhancements and put the money into making capture safer for all parties involved. There are many other projects we could do. Personally, I'd like to reduce the attrition rate on sleeping gas and tranquilizers and increase their effectiveness from the dangerous versions we have now, and try to make our less lethal options more reliably less lethal and provide more less lethal equipment and options to departments. This can be augmented in the directions of legal reform, training reform to reduce escalation, and for example, increase handling of the mentally ill, and direct reform, for example, incentivizing captures such as having bonuses for officers which secure non-lethal capture instead of fatality, larger bonuses for lower injury rates, that sort of thing. We could make it so false arrests where it's later determined there was no grounds for arrest reduce the bonus, whereas justified cases increase the bonus, and pursue as much as possible incentivizing the officers to do the job correctly and make non-lethal capture the most appealing and generally safest option. Greed is a much more powerful and psychologically less destructive motivator than fear. Is it a perfectly foolproof system that can't be abused at all? No, and anyone that expects one is disconnected from reality. There are arguments to be made that sometimes less lethal options can be used inappropriately, but I've yet to have someone show me convincing statistics having the less lethal options on hand is more hazardous than trapping an officer in the scenario of only having lethal options available. I can't give you a system where there's zero crime and zero police abuse and zero violations of due process, but we can have a system where police abuse is relegated to the same place fireman abuse is, and it's much cleaner and more successful than it is presently because protecting people's rights becomes the easiest, safest, and most incentivized course of action. We live in a world of incentives. There are a lot of different options, not just ones that I've come up with, and some of them may even work better, but it's a much better option to pursue incentivizing the desired behavior and making protecting people's rights the desirable course of action. There are a lot of different ways to go about a task as broad as increasing due process rights. Perhaps this video has altered your perspective on the topic, perhaps not. Either way, I hope you found the video helpful. And I'll see you next time.